40 years have passed, but the gunshot from when I was 20 still echoes inside my worn-out chest every night. Now, when cancer cells have eaten their way down to my final breaths, I did not choose a hospital bed. I chose to return to this Mount Hood region. In the thick fog of Oregon's deep forest, a massive 9-foot Bigfoot stepped out from the maple brush. It did not rush forward to attack the man who had wounded it all those years ago. It stopped 10 steps away from me and looked at me with painful, sorrowful eyes. I dropped to my knees in the mud, my trembling hands letting go of my walking stick, and I looked up into those wild, dark brown eyes, full of mercy, and broke down crying. My name is Howard Bennett. Last Tuesday, the doctor at a medical center outside Portland looked at me through his round glasses, sighed, and placed a thick file on the desk. He said the cells in my lungs had spread too far, and if I did not continue the final round of chemotherapy that weekend, I would have no more than 2 months left to see the sunlight. I said nothing. I only gave a small smile, stood up, shook his hand, and walked out into the hallway that smelled strongly of disinfectant without making another appointment. I had made my decision months earlier, right when the first coughing fits began draining the strength out of a 64-year-old former mechanic and hunter. I returned to my small house, where the wooden walls had turned yellow with age, and the farm tools in the shed were covered with dust. I spent that whole afternoon packing only the things that truly mattered, ignoring the expensive clothes and the keepsakes from a lonely lifetime. The old moss-green canvas backpack from my youth was pulled from the bottom of a trunk. Its straps were frayed in a few places, but the brass zippers were still firm. I did not bring any hunting rifle. The things I placed inside the backpack that day looked nothing like the gear of someone preparing to go into the woods for a hike or a hunt. First came 2 bags of rock salt, about 10 pounds, which I had bought at the general store at the edge of town the week before. Next were ripe red apples, sweet and fragrant, each one chosen by my own hand at the local farmer's market. Their skins still carried a fine pale bloom with green stems attached. And finally, deep inside a small wooden box, hidden under the drawer of my desk, I took out an object as small as a finger. It was a .30-30 brass shell casing from a Winchester rifle. Time had eaten its surface into a dull green rust, badly scratched and worn. I held it in my palm, feeling the icy cold of the old metal sink into my skin, my heart heavy with guilt that had lasted 40 years of my life. That shell casing was the physical shape of the fateful afternoon in 1986, a foggy fall day on Zigzag Mountain that I had never forgotten for even a second. Back then, I was only an arrogant 20-year-old kid. My father had just left me his lever-action Winchester, and I wanted more than anything to prove to the boys around town that I was a real hunter, a man who could walk into the woods, face whatever moved there, and come back with a story worth telling. That day, fog from the coast rolled into the valley so thick that my vision was narrowed to less than 50 feet. It wrapped itself around the trees, the rocks, and the creek until everything looked half real, like the world had been erased and redrawn in gray. I moved alone through soaked ferns, following a small, unnamed creek, hoping to find the tracks of a mature black-tailed deer. Water ran over the stones with a soft, constant sound, mixing with the wind moving through ancient Douglas firs. Together they created a lonely music that seemed to belong only to the mountain and to whatever old beings still lived in its shadows. Then, suddenly, on the far side of the creek, about 30 yards from where I stood, a huge dark shape appeared from behind a fallen tree. It rose into view slowly, impossibly tall, at least 9 feet high, with shoulders broad and lifted like a rock wall. Its entire body was covered in long, dark brown fur, wet with mist, the strands clinging to its shape and making it look even larger in the fog. In the complete panic of youth, pushed forward by foolish hunting instinct and the desperate need to prove myself, I did not think. I did not pause. I did not ask myself what kind of living thing could stand like that, move like that, or look at me from the other side of the creek with something that was not animal fear. I only raised the rifle, brought the sight to the center of that dark shape, and pulled the trigger without one moment of hesitation. The sharp crack of the .30-30 round tore through the still air of Zigzag Mountain. The empty casing flew out and struck the stone beneath my feet with a hard metallic clink, still hot and bitter with the smell of gunpowder. Right after the bullet struck the creature's body, a sound came out of it that froze every part of me. My hands began shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the rifle into the creek. It was not the furious roar of a wounded grizzly bear. It was not the scream of a cougar, not the howl of a wolf, and not the sound of any predator I had ever heard in the woods. It was a broken cry filled with pain. It was a deep, gut-wrenching scream, carrying a voice so close to human that it terrified me more than any animal sound ever could have. It carried shock, injury, confusion, and a kind of emotional wound that no young hunter should ever have caused. The giant creature dropped to one knee, and the impact shook the wet leaves near the creek. Its huge hand clutched its left shoulder, where dark blood was pouring out and spreading across a wide patch of wet fur. It lifted its head and looked toward me through the thick fog. Its large, round, dark brown eyes caught the weak afternoon light. There was no hatred in those eyes. That was what destroyed me. There was no rage. There was only horror, sorrow, and a strange, almost impossible understanding, as if the creature had already understood exactly what kind of fear had made me pull that trigger. Then, with an effort that seemed almost beyond the strength of any living body, it staggered back to its feet. One hand still held the wound, the other braced against the rock wall behind it. It disappeared into the deep forest, leaving a long trail of fresh red blood across the dry maple leaves. I stood alone in the freezing creek, unable to move, unable to breathe, while that creature's cry echoed again and again in my ears. It dug itself into my soul like a life sentence without pardon. For 40 years, every time I closed my eyes in a dark room, I still heard that cry. I still saw those dark brown, merciful eyes looking at me through the cold fog of Oregon's wilderness. Early the next morning, heavy rain was falling when I began the drive from the suburbs of Portland toward Mount Hood National Forest. My old Ford F-150 moved through a white sheet of rain, and the windshield wipers scraped across the stained glass in steady, tired squeaks. The mountain road was empty, with only rows of old fir trees standing on both sides like silent guards of time. The higher I drove, the thinner and colder the air became, and my chest began to tighten with a familiar pain. A violent, dry coughing fit suddenly hit me as I took a steep bend near the Sandy River Valley. The pain rose from the bottom of my lungs all the way into my skull. I had to pull the truck to the side of the road, both hands gripping the steering wheel as I folded forward and endured wave after wave of coughing that felt like it was tearing my chest apart from the inside. I pulled a rough cloth handkerchief from my shirt pocket and pressed it hard against my mouth. The salty, metallic taste of fresh blood soaked into the fabric almost immediately. I rested my forehead against the cold steering wheel, breathing in weak, uneven pulls, cold sweat covering my forehead, even though the temperature outside had already dropped below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I watched the rain beat non-stop against the roof of the truck, and in that sound, I understood with total clarity that the time I had left was no longer counted in months. Maybe it was only weeks now. Maybe days. Maybe hours. This trip had no road back, and I knew exactly where I was headed, toward the place I should have returned to 40 years earlier, toward the creek, the fog, the blood on maple leaves, and the eyes that had never stopped following me through the dark. When the coughing finally eased for a while, I started the engine again and kept driving until the paved road ended and turned into a rocky dirt path covered with rotting pine needles at the edge of the Mount Hood forest. I turned off the truck, pulled out the key, and sat inside the cab for a few quiet minutes, looking around at the old vehicle that had traveled with me through half my life. the cracked dashboard, the worn steering wheel, the smell of oil and old upholstery, all of it felt like a last witness. Then I opened the door and stepped out. Damp air rushed into my face, carrying the smell of dark soil, wet leaves, and pine sap, and somehow that smell felt painfully familiar, as if the forest had remembered me even when I had tried to forget it. I lifted the heavy backpack onto my shoulders. The worn strap dug into my thin shoulder, but I did not feel tired in that moment. I felt a strange calm spreading through my mind, the kind of calm that comes when a man has finally stopped running. I locked the truck door and took the first steps onto the old trail I had known in my youth, leaving the Ford F-150 behind as dry maple leaves and low fog slowly swallowed it from view. My leather boots sank into the soft earth. The sharp crack of dry sticks breaking under my feet was the only sound interrupting the deep silence of the old forest at dusk. I carried no weapon, not even a small knife tucked into my belt. I had not come here to survive. I had not come here to fight the wilderness. I had come to offer the last breaths of my life back to this place, to ask for judgment from the creature I had wounded, or simply to lie down beneath the old fir trees with a soul finally released from its own sentence. When night fully settled over the sandy valley, the darkness became so thick that I could no longer clearly see the ground beneath my feet. I stopped beside the hollow of a large fir tree, set down my backpack, and leaned against the rough bark, trying to control my breathing, which was becoming shallow and heavy because of the cold night air. The forest around me was silent in a way that felt almost unnatural. There were no insects calling, no wind moving through the brush, no small animals stirring in the leaves. It felt as if the whole forest had stopped breathing and was watching every movement of the old man who had returned after so many years. Then, from the far side of the valley, several hundred yards away, a deep sound broke the stillness. 3 heavy wood knocks rang out in a row. Knock, knock, knock. They were struck with great force against a dry tree trunk. The sound was sharp, powerful, and carried far, bouncing off the rock walls of Zigzag Mountain and rolling back in long echoes through the dark. I startled and dug both hands into the damp ground beneath me, my heart beating hard inside my thin, bony chest. I knew what that sound meant, from stories old loggers used to tell when I was young, stories we used to laugh at around diner counters and hunting cabins until we were alone in the dark and no longer laughed. It was the language of location and warning used by the giant residents of the deep forest. Those heavy knocks sounded like an announcement. They told me the forest had recognized my presence. They told me that the scarred creature from the past knew the guilty man had come back at last to face what he had done. I knelt beside the dry creek bed, my old weak knees pressing into cold pebbles covered with green moss. 40 years earlier, this creek had been full of fast water, the current strong enough to slap against my boots as I stood there with the Winchester in my hands. But now, in late fall, the Sandy was only a clear, slow strip of water moving across smooth stones, as if even the creek had grown older. With thin, trembling hands, I pulled the metal stakes from my small personal tent out of the canvas backpack. Every joint in my fingers ached whenever the wind came down from the zigzag ridge, carrying the deep cold of late Oregon fall. I had not brought a hammer, so I picked up a heavy river stone, about 2 pounds, and used it to drive each stake into the sandy, half-rotten ground. The dull sound of stone hitting metal echoed through the quiet, lonely, and strangely final, like a small funeral bell ringing for one man only. My body was very weak by then. Every time I lifted the stone, my chest rose and fell hard, and my breath came out in thick white clouds. After more than an hour of struggling with the worn gray canvas, my simple tent finally stood beside a large cedar tree, only about 10 feet from the water's edge. I knew this place was not safe by the basic survival rules of a hunter. It sat directly on the path where wild animals came down to drink, but that was exactly why I had chosen it. I zipped the tent, pulled from the bottom of my backpack 2 plastic bags filled with 10 pounds of rock salt and a bundle of ripe red apples wrapped in old newspaper. Then I walked slowly to the wide, flat stone beside the creek, the exact place where the 20-year-old version of me had stood and pulled the trigger. I poured the white salt onto the gray stone, then carefully arranged the red apples on top in a neat little circle. The apples were full and bright, some still marked with small brown scars from bird pecks, and their sweet smell stood in painful contrast to the thick odor of mud, wet bark, and dead leaves around them. This was not a hunter's bait. I knew it, and the forest knew it too. No hunter comes into the woods offering his best food without a rifle resting across his knees. I stepped back 3 paces and stood still, watching my small apology offering under the sunset fading behind Mount Hood, my heart filled with fragile hope and complete surrender before the ancient forest. Darkness fell over the sandy valley as quickly as the blink of a giant eye, pulling thick fog down from the rock walls into the creek bed. I crawled into the thin sleeping bag laid directly on the floor of the tent. I did not light a storm lantern, and I did not start a fire, because I did not want to disturb the silence of the night or turn my presence into a challenge. In that blackness, the senses of the former mechanic and hunter inside me seemed to wake up again, sharpened by old guilt and the fear of what I had come to face. A few hours after nightfall, I began to feel an invisible pressure pressing against the tent fabric. It was the unmistakable feeling of being watched from the dense cedar brush on the opposite bank. It was not the hungry attention of a mountain lion measuring distance before a pounce. It was not the nervous curiosity of black-tailed deer. It was something far larger, still, steady, and deeply aware. Then the sound I had been waiting for finally came. It began with a dry branch snapping about 50 yards upstream from my tent. After that came heavy, low footsteps, landing directly in the rocky creek bed. Each step sounded like a boulder weighing hundreds of pounds being lifted and dropped. The creek water near my tent trembled slightly, and the faint starlight on the surface shook with each step of the creature. My chest tightened. My hand gripped the rough edge of the sleeping bag, and every muscle in my body tensed with the old defensive instinct of a human being. But I felt no hatred coming from the other side. The creature stopped beside the flat stone where the apples were waiting. Its breathing filled the night, rough, deep, and enormous, like the bellows of an old forge. It stood there for a long time, less than 20 feet away from me, separated only by a thin wall of canvas that one sweep of its hand could rip open. I lay still, barely daring to breathe, listening to the apples shift softly on the stone and the slow, careful grinding of teeth. It was eating without fear, completely calm, completely in control of the valley and of me. When the sound of apples being chewed finally stopped, the valley fell back into deep silence, with only the creek whispering through cold stones. I knew the creature had not left. Its giant shadow seemed to blend with the darkness of the cedar outside my tent, giving off a raw authority that made me feel smaller than I had ever felt in my life. I could not endure that crushing silence anymore. I slowly sat up in the dark, my back leaning against the tent pole as it trembled in the strange wind. I took a deep breath, but the cold air rushed into my ruined lungs, and I could not hold back a long, dry coughing fit. My hoarse cough tore through the forest night, weak, ugly, and painfully human. I wiped the bloody spit from the corner of my mouth, then began to speak. My voice was small, shaking, and broken by the sickness that was taking my lungs. I spoke into the darkness before me, and confessed that I was the reckless boy from 40 years ago, the one who had carried a Winchester into this valley and put a cruel bullet into its left shoulder. I told it that I had lived a life without one peaceful day, that the cry of pain it made that afternoon had become a death bell inside every dream I had for half my life. I told it that I had hidden from the truth behind work, liquor, silence, and distance. but none of those things had ever been strong enough to silence what I heard in the fog that day. I did not ask it to spare me. Those cancer cells were already going to take the last of my breath within a few months, maybe within a few weeks, in some lonely hospital bed in Portland. I told it I had returned to pay the old debt. If it wanted to tear me apart or crush me under its giant foot for revenge, I would remain still and accept it. My voice dissolved into the fog of the sandy valley, mixed with my broken breathing and the hot tears running down my wrinkled, dirt-covered cheeks. No roar answered me, no violence came, only the wind moved through the old firs like the silent witness of the ancient forest, listening to a guilty soul confess on its knees. The next morning, when the first light struggled through the thick fog and reached down into the creek bed, I slowly unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The morning air was about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and frost lay over the low fern branches like a white layer of sugar. I looked toward the flat stone beside the creek and stopped. Every red apple and all 10 pounds of rock salt from the day before had disappeared without a trace. The stone surface was clean, as if nothing had ever been placed there. But right in the center of the stone, where I had arranged the circle of apples, there was a strange object that the forest could not have placed there by accident. It was a bundle of cedar leaves, about the size of 2 cupped human hands. The stems and dark green leaves had been crushed with careful strength, making sap run out and release a sharp, spicy, gentle scent into the air. As a former hunter who had spent half his life near these mountains, I recognized the native medicine plant at once. It was the kind old native people once used to press onto open wounds to stop bleeding, or boil into tea to calm the kind of deep, tearing cough that seemed to come from the bottom of the lungs. I walked closer to the stone, my knees shaking with emotion. I knelt down and lifted the crushed cedar leaves with both hands, bringing them to my nose so I could breathe in their wild scent. The sap was still slightly warm, which meant the creature had left only a short time before, just before the sun came up behind the ancient firs. I pressed the crushed cedar leaves against my thin, bony chest and felt that wordless but powerful emotion moving into every dying cell inside me. The crushed medicinal leaves on that flat stone hit the last piece of human pride inside me like cold water. They made me understand a truth that was both terrifying and sacred. The giant creature had not forgotten me. It recognized the man over 60, the face and the scent of the person who had brought pain to it in this creek bed 40 years earlier. But instead of using the overwhelming strength of a legendary cryptid to destroy its old enemy, it chose to answer with understanding and compassion, far beyond anything humans usually understand. It knew I was dying. My sick, broken cough from the night before had reached its ears, and the fact that my backpack held no rifle had shown it why I had come. The crushed cedar leaves were the forest's reply, a delicate, wordless message that it had accepted my late apology and was trying to keep alive the man who had once wounded it. I sat down on the pebbles, clutching the medicine leaves to my chest, filled with a sad warmth and a gentle awe before a wild intelligence that felt more human than many people I had known. I put a few pieces of the crushed leaves into my mouth and chewed slowly. The bitter taste rose into my nose, sharp at first, then softened into a warm current that traveled down into my tight lungs, easing the stabbing pain in an almost miraculous way. I looked around at the thick brush surrounding the sandy valley and knew it was still somewhere behind those tall Douglas firs, silently watching everything I did with a patience and mercy I did not deserve. For the first time in 40 years, I was not being hunted by the memory of that gunshot. I was being watched over by the one I had wounded. Around 3 in the afternoon, the sky above Mount Hood suddenly turned the dull gray of lead. Huge storm clouds from the Pacific rolled in fast, swallowing the last weak sunlight of the fall day. The wind began screaming through the cuts of the zigzag ridge, and the temperature dropped quickly, falling below 32 degrees Fahrenheit in less than an hour. I knew a dangerous first snowstorm of the season was coming, the kind of weather that could kill even an experienced hunter if he did not have strong shelter made of wood or stone. The first snowflakes, large as fingers, began to fall thick and hard, striking my face with icy pain while I tried to use extra rope to reinforce the roof of my thin canvas tent. But the strength of a body in the final stage of cancer would not let me finish the work. My hands lost all feeling from the cold. The stone I was using as a hammer slipped from my fingers and fell into the freezing creek. Then, a violent gust came down from the mountain into the valley, screaming like a pack of wild beasts. It tore the metal stakes out of the rotten sandy ground. My small tent collapsed completely in a single moment, the canvas heavy with white snow falling over my body and pinning me to the frozen earth beside Sandy Creek. I tried to struggle out from the wreckage, but the bone-deep cold of the snow began soaking through my worn old coat. My whole body shook violently, then slowly began turning numb. My heartbeat slowed. My breath broke into tiny groans, and my chest locked so tight that I could not pull a full mouth of freezing air into my lungs. In the delirium of severe hypothermia, when my eyes began to blur and my awareness sank into a gray emptiness, I heard giant footsteps running through the deep snow, coming straight toward me, closer with every heavy step. I lay curled beneath the torn canvas of my collapsed tent, both knees pulled tight to my chin as I tried to hold on to the last small warmth inside my failing body. The old gray canvas was now heavy with pounds of snow pouring down from the zigzag ridge, pressing against my shoulders and hips like an icy stone slab. Frost slipped through every gap in my worn coat and sank deep into my skin, numbing my nerves until I could no longer feel clear pain. There was only a cold emptiness spreading over everything. The temperature outside had dropped dangerously below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the Sandy River Valley into a giant freezer filled with broken ice, frost, and white silence. I tried to open my eyes, but my lashes were frozen together. All I could see were blurry gray lines of the wild night sky. My breath came out in broken sounds through cracked lips. Every inhale scraped my ruined lungs with air sharp as a razor. My thoughts drifted in and out. Memories of my small house in Portland, my oil-stained mechanic shop, my father's Winchester, and faces of strangers appeared and vanished into colorless space. I knew I was standing at the final edge of survival, where late-stage lung cancer and the cold of Oregon's wilderness were working together to take away the last breath inside me. In that moment near death, I did not feel the panic or terror I had felt 40 years before. I felt surrender. I felt a strange, peaceful acceptance. I had brought myself back to the place where all my guilt began, and lying down forever beneath this old fir seemed like the most fitting end for a hunter who had carried a private sentence for half his life. The storm wind kept roaring over Mount Hood, breaking dry pine limbs and dropping them hard onto the frozen ground, creating a dark funeral song in the empty, deep forest. Just as my awareness was about to slip into a long sleep with no waking, a sudden pressure appeared above the tent canvas that was crushing me. The huge weight of snow suddenly lifted as a powerful force pulled the torn roof up and away from my body. Then a wave of heat rushed into the space, rich with the smell of old pine sap and ancient forest soil, pushing back the freezing cold that had surrounded me. I felt something enormous kneel beside me, blocking the violent wind coming in from the sandy valley. A giant hand, at least 4 times wider than the hand of a grown man, slowly slid beneath my back. Its fingers were rough and rugged, like the bark of an ancient cedar, but they were covered in thick, dark brown fur. They lifted my thin body from the frozen ground with surprising gentleness. My nearly 160-pound weight fit in that palm like the weight of a newborn child. I was held carefully, on purpose, as if the creature understood that my ribs, showing beneath my worn clothes, could break under too much pressure. I felt the thick skin and hard calluses inside its palm brush against my side, giving off heat like a stone furnace. The giant being pressed me close to its broad chest and used its powerful shoulder to shield me from the snow whipping through the air. I could not open my eyes. I could not speak. I could only feel my body being carried quickly through deep snow by incredibly steady steps, leaving behind the ruined canvas tent that the blizzard was already burying under the white weight of the mountain. When I slowly opened my eyes again, the freezing cold of the sandy valley had vanished. In its place was warm air touched with the smell of wood smoke and the sharp scent of familiar herbs. I realized I was lying on a bed made of dry Douglas fir needles and soft forest moss inside a narrow rock cave. The cave was hidden behind a large rock wall, and from where I lay, I could hear the deep roar of a waterfall outside, half frozen by the storm. In the center of the cave, a small fire was burning low. Dry pine wood cracked and popped, sending warm orange-yellow light across gray cave walls darkened by soot. What amazed me most was that the fire had clearly been started long before by hands that were not human. There was no iron stove, no human fireplace, only smooth river stones arranged in a perfect circle to hold the coals. On a flat stone beside the fire, a few pieces of sweet root and dry pine cones had been placed neatly, as if someone had prepared a winter shelter in this cave months ahead of time. I shifted my shoulder and realized my coat, soaked with snow, had been removed. Instead, my body was covered with warm, dry leaves that were slowly helping my temperature return. I took one long breath. The tightness in my chest had eased because of the fire's warmth, though I knew the biological death of my sick body was still counting down with every weak beat of my heart. I had not been dragged here as prey. I had been carried here as something fragile, something in need of shelter. I slowly turned my head toward the dark corner of the cave, where the orange firelight did not fully reach, and I immediately saw a massive shape sitting still. It was Silver Scar, the adult male Bigfoot I had been searching for across 40 years, now here in flesh and blood, less than 10 feet away from me. The creature sat cross-legged on the stone floor. Its wide back was slightly hunched, making its usual 9-foot height appear a little smaller, but it still carried the heavy authority of a lord of the deep forest. Its whole body was covered in long, dark, gray-brown fur, still holding small beads of night dew that had not dried, except for one large patch on the left shoulder. There, the firelight revealed a huge silver scar, twisted, wrinkled, and uneven. The flesh pulled tight with every deep, heavy breath. That was the mark left by the .30-30 bullet from my Winchester in 1986, a wound that had never fully healed and had turned its movement into a shoulder-leaning limp for half a century. The Bigfoot's large, round, dark brown eyes reflected the red firelight. They were deep, old, and fixed directly on me from the darkness. In that gaze, I found no aggression. I found no hatred. I found no predator's anger toward an old enemy. It looked at me with quiet patience, with the understanding mercy of a creature that had survived countless snowstorms on Zigzag Mountain and had watched generations of living things be born, suffer, and disappear under the firs. I used the small amount of strength that had returned to crawl out from the bed of dry pine needles. My thin hands pressed against the cold cave floor as I pulled my body toward the dark corner. Every movement was heavy. My bones cracked softly, mixing with the hard breathing of a dying man holding his chest. The giant creature did not move. It only tilted its massive head slightly to one side, its dark brown eyes following every painful inch I dragged myself forward. It did not reach out to stop me. It did not make any defensive movement. When there were only about 3 feet between us, I stopped and knelt on the stone floor near the dying fire. With trembling hands, I reached into the pocket of my old worn wool coat lying in the corner, pulled out the small wooden box, and took out the brass shell casing from long ago. The green rusted .30-30 casing lay small inside my wrinkled palm, marked with dry blood, catching the firelight in weak, guilty flashes. I looked up at the Bigfoot's fur-covered face, and hot tears spilled again, running through the deep lines of my old face. I placed the brass casing on the flat stone between us and slowly pushed it toward the creature's giant hand. It was a late confession. It was the surrender of a guilty man's body and soul to the final judgment of the old forest. It was the only physical piece of my sin I still had left to offer. The giant creature slowly lowered its powerful head, and its dark brown eyes studied the tiny metal object lying on the flat stone. It showed no surprise. It showed no anger. It seemed as if it had known exactly what the object was from the moment I entered the sandy valley, carrying the scent of old brass and rust. Then, with an extremely slow movement, the Bigfoot reached forward with a hand 4 times larger than a human hand, its thick, furred fingers lowering through the firelight. Instead of picking up the casing to crush it or throw it away, the creature changed the direction of its hand and gently placed the rough tips of its fingers, coarse like cedar bark, against the center of my thin, bony chest. Its touch was as light as it could possibly be, just enough to feel the chaotic, weak beating of my heart after so many long fits of coughing blood. That touch carried a soft warmth that spread through my whole body, driving away the last pieces of ice still clinging inside my ruined lungs. The Bigfoot stayed still, holding its hand there like a priest, blessing a sinner before the final sentence. That wordless act of mercy broke apart 40 years of guilt inside me. Everything I had carried for so long cracked open, and a bittersweet peace poured out of me through my choking tears. It did not forgive me with words. It forgave me by choosing not to destroy me. The next 3 days seemed to exist outside every rule of the busy world beyond the mountain. They were a long, quiet pause while the first snowstorm of the season turned the entire sandy river valley into an isolated white wilderness. Inside the narrow rock cave, hidden behind the frozen curtain of a waterfall, where ice columns hung down nearly 15 feet, there were only 2 old, damaged lives leaning on each other for a little warmth. One was me, a dying mechanic and hunter whose chest was being destroyed hour by malignant cells. The other was the legendary giant creature of Zigzag Mountain, carrying on its left shoulder a gray, twisted scar caused by my own hand 40 years earlier. The cave, less than 12 square feet wide, became a tiny world where time moved only through the crackle of dry pine logs and the breathing of 2 beings who should have been enemies. Outside the rock wall, the wind screamed and slammed heavy sheets of snow against every crack. But inside, the silence was so deep that I could hear each slow beat of my heart blending with the steady rise and fall of the Bigfoot's massive chest. I sat with my back against the rough stone wall, my legs covered by dry pine needles, quietly watching the great figure sitting cross-legged across from me through the warm orange glow of the fire. Its body was enormous, filling an entire gray corner of the cave, but the slightly bent posture and the dark brown fur turning ash gray near the edges of its ears showed that time had placed its weight on it, too. We did not move much. There were no threatening sounds. Its presence felt like a solid wall of stone, keeping the cold of nature from entering the last rooms of my fading soul. Sometimes I fell asleep in a low fever, then woke suddenly in the middle of the night, and those dark brown eyes reflecting red firelight were still there, watching me with patience, giving silent protection that needed no human promise. On the second day of the storm, when the pile of pine wood inside the cave had already gone down by a third, the giant creature began sharing its stored food with the old enemy lying near its fire. It stretched one long arm past its knees toward a dark hollow deep inside the cave, and slowly pulled out several wild roots, each about 8 inches long, thick, and covered with dry brown soil, along with a few strips of smoked salmon, so dry they had shrunk and turned dark red, like old cured meat. It placed the food on the flat stone between us, then used one huge finger, with a thick, rough nail like a horn spoon, to push one root toward me. I took it in my hand. The root's skin was rough and still held bits of dry earth, When I raised it to my mouth and bit into it, a cool, clean sweetness rose through my nose and soothed my throat, which was raw from wood smoke and long coughing fits. But what moved me more than the food was the way the creature had learned to communicate, and the way it softened its own enormous strength to care for a human body that could barely hold itself together. When it saw me coughing hard after swallowing a small piece of dried salmon, it stood and took heavy steps toward a shallow pool of water collected from underground drips in the corner of the cave. The stone floor trembled lightly beneath its weight. The Bigfoot bent down, used both giant hands to fold a wide piece of old maple bark about the size of a dinner plate into a temporary bowl, then filled it with clear water. It came back, knelt on one knee beside me, and carefully held the fragile edge of the bark with 3 large, clumsy fingertips, bringing it to my lips. A hand that could easily break a young pine trunk 6 inches thick was now trembling with effort, trying not to crush the bark bowl and trying not to spill even a drop of water onto my wool sweater. I tilted my head and drank slow mouthfuls of cool water, feeling the rough rim of the maple bark touch my lips, and feeling the rich warmth from the long fur on the back of its hand against my face. It was a tenderness so careful and unbelievable that I could hardly understand it coming from a beast of the deep forest. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, when another violent gust struck the rock wall outside and made the fire shake, the guilt that had been building inside me for half a lifetime suddenly rose into my throat. I looked at the twisted silver scar on the Bigfoot's left shoulder. The scar was bare under the firelight, wrinkled and stripped of its protective fur, living proof of the cruelty and arrogance of the 20-year-old hunter I had once been. I could not hold back the urge rising from the deepest part of me. Slowly, I reached my trembling hand, spotted with age and lined with blue veins, toward that giant shoulder. The creature flinched slightly. Every powerful muscle in its body tightened for 1 second, and its dark brown eyes narrowed with natural caution, the reflex of a wild being that had once been hunted and wounded. But I did not pull my hand back. I held it in the air for several seconds, palm open and facing upward, to show complete surrender, to show I carried no weapon. The Bigfoot looked into my eyes and saw the tears waiting there. Slowly, it lowered its shoulders and allowed my thin fingers to touch the cold, silver scar tissue. The scar felt rough, like a strip of dried leather, pulling tight beneath my palm as I gently stroked along the length of the old bullet wound. Then I began to sob out loud, the hoarse, broken sobs of an old man close to the earth. My knees sank onto the pine dust-covered cave floor. I pressed my forehead below that scar, and my lips kept moving with the same 3 words. "I'm sorry." I said them again and again, words pouring out from the deepest part of me, words I had hidden for decades behind liquor, work, silence, and sleepless nights in Portland. I was sorry for bringing the Winchester into this valley. I was sorry for breaking its peace. I was sorry for leaving it to carry that pain through 40 years of loneliness in the old forest. As I sobbed, with my chest tightening and another attack waiting to come, the giant creature did not push me away. It did not roar in anger. Instead, a very strange sound began rising from deep inside its broad chest. It was a low, steady rumble at an extremely deep frequency, almost like the satisfied purr of a large cat, but heavier and thicker many times over. The sound did not simply echo off the cave walls. It vibrated through flesh and bone. It moved through my palm and forehead where they touched the creature's body, creating a strange, soothing power that washed away the mental pain tearing through me. It was not a threatening sound. It was the private language of the old forest. A healing sound, as if it were telling me that all hatred from the past had long ago been carried away by the snow and wind of the sandy valley. The Bigfoot leaned slightly and allowed me to rest my head against the thick, warm fur of its chest. The rumble continued steadily for almost an hour, blending with my breath as it slowly became calmer. In that moment, I understood that forgiveness does not need papers, ceremonies, or beautiful human speeches. It exists inside this merciful silence, inside the way a legendary creature allowed the one who had heard it to lean against its chest and search for comfort at the end of life. Life inside the rock cave continued slowly, in a strange, shared rhythm, as the Bigfoot began helping me with almost every small task because my body had entered complete collapse. By the fourth day, my old legs had lost nearly all feeling. Whenever I tried to stand and make my way toward the cave entrance to gather clean snow for water, my knees buckled and my body fell forward. But before I could strike the sharp stones, one long arm covered in thick fur reached out, gently caught me under the armpit, and lifted me as if I were a fallen leaf. It helped me stand upright, one large hand hovering behind my back as a strong support, patiently moving inch by inch with the painful dragging steps I took across the cave floor. And when night came, when the cruel wind pushed through the narrow cracks behind the cave and brought in air colder than 30 degrees Fahrenheit, the Bigfoot changed where it sat. It no longer stayed in the dark corner. It moved close to the edge of my pine needle bed and turned its huge back toward the wind gap, using its 9-foot, nearly 800-pound body as a living wall to block the cold air from reaching me. I lay among the dry leaves and watched its enormous back fill the cave opening under faint starlight, and my heart filled with a gentle warmth I had never known from people. It was a strange bond that reached beyond species, beyond words, beyond every civilized idea I had ever carried back in Portland. The forest had become a church, the cave had become a confession room, and the creature I had once feared had become the only guardian left beside me. By dawn on the fifth day, the violent roar of the snowstorm outside the sandy valley suddenly stopped, giving way to the deep silence of an old forest morning. The first dry, golden rays of late fall sunlight began passing through the gaps in the frozen waterfall curtain, casting bright, diamond-like lines across the gray stone floor. I slowly opened my eyes and felt a clear change happening inside my body, the kind of change that tells a man his final moment has arrived. The cold air entering my lungs no longer caused the tearing coughs that had ripped through my chest in the days before. When I wiped the corner of my mouth out of habit, there was no fresh red blood on my palm. Instead, a strange lightness, empty and warm, began spreading from my toes and moving slowly upward toward the top of my head. I no longer felt the full weight of my body. I no longer felt the sharp pain of the cancer. I knew that sign. It was the moment when the body's organs stop fighting and begin letting go, preparing to enter an eternal sleep beneath Zigzag Mountain. I turned to look at the Bigfoot. The creature was looking back at me, its dark brown eyes reflecting the golden dawn, deep and still like the dry creek outside. It seemed to know, too, that the old hunter's journey of apology had reached its final steps. There was no fear between us now. There was only the quiet understanding of two wounded beings who had finally reached the end of a long circle. The giant creature slowly knelt on one knee on the cave floor, bending its wide, dark brown back forward so I could hold on. With the last strength left in my thin arms, I wrapped them around its powerful shoulders, around the wrinkled silver scar that my bullet had left there long ago. With a careful, gentle motion, the Bigfoot lifted me and placed me against its broad back as if I were a weightless canvas backpack. Its heavy, steady footsteps landed on the stone floor, carrying me slowly out of the warm darkness of the narrow cave. We passed through the old waterfall curtain, now frozen into long columns of ice, and moved through cedar bushes pressed low by snow. The creature's breath came out in warm, white clouds beside my cheek, rich with the wild scent of pine sap, protecting me from the cold gusts left behind by the storm. It carried me along the dry creek bed, covered with pebbles, each step slow but certain, bringing the old hunter back to the flat stone beside the sandy river. This was the place where, 40 years earlier, the Winchester in the hands of a reckless young man had stolen peace from the deep forest. And it was also the place where my apology offering of rock salt and ripe fruit had been accepted, Returning to that exact place felt like a circle of fate, where all pain had begun and where every blood debt was meant to close. The mountain, the creek, the stone, and the fog all stood witness around us like old judges who had waited a lifetime for this final act. The creature slowly lowered its powerful body close to the wild ground. Its rough hands held my hips and set me sitting with my back against an ancient Douglas fir, its bark rough and almost 3 inches thick. The late afternoon sunlight after the storm suddenly broke through, washing the whole sandy river valley in bright, warm gold and turning the white snow into a shining mirror. I rested my head against the old fir trunk. My chest no longer tightened in those painful spasms. It felt strangely light, almost weightless. My clouded eyes looked toward Mount Hood, standing tall and white on the horizon. Oregon's late fall wilderness spread before me, vast and silent, in a way that felt sacred. There were no rifle shots. There was no chase. There was no young man trying to prove anything. There was only the sound of water slipping through frozen stones and the soft breathing of a creature that had every right to hate me, but had chosen not to. The Bigfoot stepped back 3 paces. Its 9-foot figure stood in the dry, golden light, the dark brown fur on its shoulders moving slightly in the soft wind. It looked at me, then toward the distant mountain, as if the two of us were sharing one of the rare, peaceful moments the valley offered after days of violent storm. The giant creature suddenly bent down toward the flat stone and used 2 large, rough, careful fingers to pick up the green rusted brass shell casing from 1986, lying there quietly. It raised the tiny metal object to the level of its dark brown eyes and studied the dull brass for a long time under the fading late afternoon light. Then, with terrifying strength, from 2 fingers rough like cedar bark, the Bigfoot crushed the .30-30 casing into pieces, turning the hard metal into tiny twisted copper fragments. It stretched its long arm toward the edge of the water and slowly opened its palm. The small copper pieces fell into Sandy Creek and sank into the current, moving downstream. The quiet sound of metal touching stones under the water clicked softly, then disappeared. With it went every terrible memory of the gunshot from 40 years before, dissolving into the cold current. That wordless act was like a ritual, cutting away the old blood debt, freeing both souls from the chain of guilt that had bound them for so long. It was not revenge, it was not punishment. It was release. It was the forest saying that the past had finally been returned to the water. I watched the last copper pieces disappear beneath the creek water. The corner of my mouth lifted into a smile, the fullest and lightest smile I had known after 40 long years of living in the shadow of sin. Every burden on my faith, every sleepless night in Portland filled with the smell of alcohol and the hoarse cry of a wounded creature, had now been washed clean by the mercy of the Lord of the old forest. I slowly closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of Mount Hood's sunlight touch my wrinkled cheek. My breathing grew thin, then lighter, then faded into an eternal sleep among the rich smell of dry pine needles and ancient wet earth. My awareness no longer held pain. It no longer held cancer. It no longer held the screaming echo of the gunshot. There was only a dry, golden space of evening sunlight surrounding the worn-out body of a man who had finally completed the final apology of his life. I sat silently beneath the Douglas fir, feeling handfuls of dry leaves and damp forest moss being gently placed over me by the Bigfoot's giant hands. When the layer of medicine leaves and wild humus slowly covered my worn wool coat, the creature stopped and stood tall like a stone statue in the fading sunset. It looked at me one last time with deep, dark brown eyes. Its powerful chest trembled with one low, sorrowful sound. Then it slowly turned away. Its great 9-foot figure passed through the cedar brush, walking with long, steady steps toward the upper sandy valley before disappearing completely into the thick fog rolling down from the rock walls of Zigzag Mountain. When darkness covered everything, the looping delirium that had wrapped around me through those 5 days of snowstorm slowly began to fade. By some invisible strength I still cannot explain, I pushed myself up, brushed the pine leaves from my body, and slowly crawled out of the dry creek bed. The sandy valley was silent now. There was no hatred, there was no rifle shot. There was only the sound of water flowing through frozen stones like a farewell. I gathered the remains of the canvas tent, lifted the backpack onto my thin shoulder, and began walking back toward the main road at the edge of the forest. Each step felt light. My chest no longer carried the bloody coughing that had torn through my lungs, because the blood debt that had followed me for 40 years had been forgiven by the mercy of the deep forest. Whether those days in the cave had been a miracle, a fever vision, or a truth too large for ordinary language, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had returned to the place of my sin, and the forest had allowed me to leave with my soul unchained. I returned to my small house outside Portland with a soul that had completely changed. 3 years have passed since that fateful journey, and the final stage lung cancer is still slowly eating away the last biological breaths left inside me. But I am no longer afraid. I no longer reach for liquor to escape the nightmares. I no longer wake up with my hands searching for a rifle that is not there. Every afternoon, I make a cup of tea and sit in the old armchair on the porch, quietly watching the distant zigzag range fade into the morning mist. I live the last days of my life in a sacred stillness, calmly accepting death as it comes closer, because I know that somewhere deep in the Oregon wilderness, Silver Scar is still walking free, and my soul now belongs to the great mercy of the old forest. I opened my eyes and suddenly woke in the old armchair on the porch of my small house near the edge of the forest, my chest rising as I drew in a deep breath of clean morning air. The dream, or maybe the strange journey to the Sandy River Valley 3 years earlier, was still alive inside every cell of me, so real that I could almost smell the old pine sap and feel the rough cedar bark texture of that giant hand. I looked down at my wrinkled hands. They no longer trembled with fear or guilt. They carried a quiet peace I had never known before. The final stage lung cancer was still slowly eating away the little breath I had left each day, but my heart had been completely healed and made peaceful after that fateful journey of apology. Every afternoon I sit on the porch and look quietly toward the dark green Douglas fir ridges stretching into the distance, accepting and waiting for death with the freest heart I have ever had. I know that somewhere deep inside the fog of Zigzag Mountain, the giant creature with the silver scar on its left shoulder is still alive, silently protecting the peace of the deep forest. And the story between us will remain forever under the old fir canopies, like a warm legend about compassion that crosses the boundaries of species. Hello, friends. I'm Victor. We have just walked together through the final steps of Howard's journey and the creature he called Silver Scar. I believe many of you may be sitting quietly in front of the screen right now, just as I did when I first read these lines from Howard's journal. This was not a frightening story about bloody hunts. It was not a dry scientific theory about some unnamed primate living in the mountains. It was a tragic and beautiful song of nature, a raw but warm piece of redemption, compassion, and forgiveness that rises beyond every boundary between species. It was a story about what happens when a man stops running from the worst thing he has ever done and finally returns to the place where the wound began. Think about Howard at 50. Or about the reckless 20-year-old boy he was back in 1986. He represented the most instinctive and arrogant side of humanity when facing the natural world. A loaded Winchester, a trigger pulled in the name of conquest, and a wound driven into the left shoulder of an innocent creature. But nature does not operate by human hatred. For 40 years, while Howard locked himself inside a prison of guilt, destroying himself with alcohol, silence, and nightmares in Portland, that creature kept living in the Sandy River Valley beneath Zigzag Mountain. It carried a wrinkled silver scar on its body, but it also carried a great, wild intelligence, the kind of intelligence we civilized humans sometimes lose inside concrete, steel, noise, and pride. The scar did not turn it into a monster. The pain did not turn it into a killer. Instead, it remained a guardian of the valley, old, wounded, powerful, and still capable of mercy. The most moving moment may have been those 3 days of snowstorm inside the narrow cave. When death came close, in the cold, below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, the line between hunter and prey disappeared completely. Only 2 old, damaged lives remained, leaning on each other for warmth. Imagine the Bigfoot's giant hand, rough like cedar bark, strong enough to break a young pine trunk, trembling with careful effort as it held a bowl made from maple bark, trying not to let even 1 drop of water spill past Howard's lips. That was a primal tenderness, a patient, slow-burn connection created without a single human word. It proved that the language of understanding does not need speech. It lives in the act of sharing sweet roots. It lives in the low rumble that calmed the chest. It lives in the way the creature used its great back to block every cold wind for the man who had once wounded it. And maybe that is why this story feels so powerful. Because the creature did not forgive Howard after Howard became innocent. It forgave him while the scar was still there. The lesson Howard's story gives us today is a lesson about making peace with ourselves and with the deep forest. We often step into the woods with the mind of people who want to take, conquer, prove, or expose mysteries. We want photographs, trophies, proof, names, and control. But the Sandy Valley teaches us that reverence and compassion are the only keys that can open the heart of the wild world. When the creature crushed the green rusted .30-30 shell casing and let it drift away in the creek, it was not only erasing a blood debt, it was sending a message that the past had passed. Hatred had turned back into dust, and the only thing left was peace in the final breath beneath the Douglas firs. Sometimes forgiveness is not a word spoken aloud. Sometimes it is a hand placed gently on a dying man's chest. Sometimes it is a shell casing crushed into pieces and given back to the river. Howard has passed on, or maybe he is still sitting on his porch in the final days of his life as a kind of reward for redemption. But the spirit of that journey remains here, reminding us of a world where beings like Bigfoot or Dogman are not monsters. They are ancient residents, silent guardians of the old forest, carrying a kind of mercy that humanity should lower its head and learn from. They may be frightening because they are powerful, because they are unknown, and because they belong to a world older than ours. But power does not always mean cruelty, and mystery does not always mean danger. Sometimes the thing we fear most is the very thing that can teach us how to become human again. If Victor's story today touched a deep place in your heart, if you could feel the warmth of that cave fire in the middle of the Oregon snowstorm, then please leave a like and a comment below this video to share your feelings. Tell me which moment stayed with you the longest. Was it Howard kneeling beside the creek with the apples and salt? Was it the bundle of crushed cedar leaves left on the stone? Was it the Bigfoot carrying him out of the snow? Or was it the moment that old shell casing finally disappeared beneath the water after 40 years of guilt? Most importantly, do not forget to subscribe to Bigfoot Sasquatch Story and turn on the notification bell. That way you will not miss any future journeys into wild mysteries, emotional stories, and gentle but deeply moving tales that we bring to you. Let's help Victor spread these warm messages to more people, so we can look at the deep forest and the legendary beings hidden in the fog with more mercy, more respect, and more understanding. The more we listen, the more we realize that the wilderness is not empty. It is watching, remembering, protecting, and sometimes, if we are humble enough, forgiving. Thank you for listening. Goodbye, and I will see you again in the next stories on Bigfoot Sasquatch Story. I wish you a peaceful night on your own porch.